All right, let's dive in, shall we? Today we're going to be looking into a case that really makes you think about what makes a criminal, Gary Martin.
Yeah, Gary Rardon, he's a convicted serial killer, but his story doesn't exactly fit the mold.
It really doesn't. I mean, you usually hear about these guys coming from like really rough backgrounds, right? Abuse, neglect, that sort of thing.
Exactly, yeah. But with Rardon, he actually described his upbringing as almost, well, too perfect, he said.
Too perfect. What do you even, I mean, how does that even,
It's a head scratcher, right? It makes you wonder if maybe that whole perfect family thing was just a facade, maybe covering up some deeper issues. Or maybe he felt like he could never live up to those expectations, like it was all just too much pressure.
yeah, maybe he felt stifled, like he couldn't be himself or something. Well, let's go back to the beginning, back to 1962. Rardon was 19 when he committed his first murder.
Right, 19 years old, he shot and killed a 23-year-old ex-Marine, James Homer Smith.
And not just once, twice. You shot him in the head twice after Smith had given him a ride, then stuffed his body in the victim's own car. Chilling, right?
It's a pretty brutal start to the story, and what's interesting is Rardon actually claimed self-defense at first.
Oh, really? What was his story?
Said that Smith had made some unwanted sexual advances, so, already you see this potential for manipulation there, trying to twist the narrative to fit his own needs. Even at that young age, there's a kind of calculated behavior there.
So was this like a sign of things to come? Or just a kid tried to get himself out of a bad situation? Whatever the case, he ended up pleading guilty to a lesser charge, voluntary manslaughter. Still did time, though. And during that time, his father, who was visiting him regularly, died of a heart attack.
And Rardon's grandfather, he was convinced that his father had died of a broken heart, just couldn't handle the weight of his son's actions. That's a heavy burden to carry.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you consider that Rardon had wanted to be an FBI agent when he was a kid. What a weird twist, huh?
Talk about irony, right? But here's where things get even stranger. In 1967, Rardon is paroled. A psychiatrist determined that he wasn't likely to be violent again.
So he gets out, right? Starts over?
Well, sort of. Turns out, later on, Rardon admitted that after that evaluation, he actually worked for that psychiatrist.
Right, seriously, as in like he was employed by the guy who evaluated him?
Yep, as a medical records keeper. It makes you wonder, like, could he have manipulated the psychiatrist during that evaluation? I mean, it's almost too bizarre to be a coincidence.
It really is. Did they ever look into that or?
I don't think we'll ever know for sure, but it definitely casts a shadow over that whole parole decision. Was Rardon playing the system from the very beginning? It's hard to say. But in any case, that newfound freedom didn't last long.
What happened?
1969, Rorary conviction, back to prison. And what happens after the second release, well, that's when things take a really dark turn. That's what sets the stage for those terrifying Chicago murders.
Okay, so let's hear about that. This second release. What happens?
Well, you'd think that all those years behind bars would have scared him straight, right? But in Rodden's case, it seems like they might have just fueled the fire. The anger, the resentment, it was all just bubbling under the surface.
So ticking time bomb, basically.
Pretty much. He gets out, remarries, even gets a decent job, a machinist. For a while there, it looks like he might actually be turning things around.
Right, trying to build a normal life.
Exactly. But then the stability crumbles. He gets bored with the job, leaves his wife, the bills start piling up. Not a good combination for anyone, let alone someone with Rardon's history.
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
And that's when things really start to unravel. He finds his father-in-law's shotgun, and get this, he saws off the barrel. Talk about chilling, right? Almost like a symbolic gesture, like he's committing to a life of violence.
And then, summer of 1974, Chicago, everything changes. 4 days, 3 lives.
Yeah, a wave of terror washes over the city. And it's not random. There's a horrifying pattern to Rardon killings in Chicago, a brutality that's hard to even wrap your head around. It's easy to focus on just the facts of the case, but, we can't forget about the victims. These were real people, people with families, with lives, with dreams. And those dreams were, well, they were stolen.
Right, it's important to remember that, to think about the human cost to these crimes. So who were these victims?
Well, the first victim, his name was Gene Ravenscraft. He was 28 years old, working overtime to support his family. His wife was pregnant. They had 2 young kids.
Oh, man.
Rardon shot him in his office late one night, stole $23 in his coat. Just $23. Imagine the devastation for that family. A young father, gone. Just like that.
It's just senseless.
Exactly. And then, just 2 days later, Rardon strikes again. This time, it's a cab driver, Herbert Noakes, 31 years old. And get this, he was just days away from his wedding.
Oh, wow. That's awful.
He was shot and robbed of $63. His fiancée, his family, left to pick up the pieces. And then the third victim, Asher Gruenberg, A 50-year-old World War II veteran family man. He was getting ready for his son's bar mitzvah.
It's like he was targeting completely random people. Different ages, different backgrounds.
Right, and the amounts of money he stole, they were so small. It almost makes you think that the money wasn't even the point, like it was just an afterthought.
So then what was the motive? What was driving him to do this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was it the power? The control? Some psychologists believe that serial killers get a sense of dominance over their victims, like it fulfills some kind of twisted need.
Yeah, I've heard that theory before, but what's even more disturbing is that there was a pattern to these killings. Each victim was shot once in the left side of the neck, like a signature.
Right. It's chilling, isn't it? It's almost like he was marking his territory in a way, leaving his stamp on each crime. Makes you wonder about the psychology behind it.
For sure. But you'd think the guy who was so careful about the way he killed would be more careful about not getting caught, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But like a lot of criminals, Rardon got sloppy. He used one of his victims' credit cards to buy gas, even signed the receipt with the victim's name. And there were other clues, too. All of it led the police right to him in Laurieville, Kentucky.
He just took off after the murders.
Yep, seems like he thought he could just disappear. But when they caught him, you want to know what he was wearing? One of his victim's coats. And he was carrying another victim's ID.
Seriously, that's unbelievable. I mean, the guy murders 3 people in cold blood, but then he makes these dumb mistakes that lead straight to him. It doesn't make sense.
It's a strange thing. You see it all the time in criminal cases. This meticulous planning, this careful execution of the crime itself, and then, boom, they trip up on something totally obvious, almost like they want to get caught.
Maybe they do. Maybe there's some subconscious desire to, I don't know, to be punished or something.
It's possible. Who knows what goes on in the minds of these people? But what's interesting is that Rardon didn't even try to deny it. He confessed to all 3 murders almost immediately.
Maybe he wanted to get it off his chest, Or maybe it was some kind of twisted pride, like he wanted credit for what he'd done.
Hard to say for sure, but his confession definitely moved the legal process along. He pleaded guilty to the federal charges, transporting a stolen vehicle, possessing an unregistered firearm, and to the state charges, 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of armed robbery.
So did he get the death penalty?
Well, here's where things get a little complicated. At the time, Illinois hadn't yet reinstated the death penalty, so even though these were some of the most brutal crimes imaginable, the judge sentenced Rardon to 3 concurrent terms of 40 to 100 years in prison.
Wow. 40 to 100 years. That's a long time, but I'm sure the victims' families felt like it wasn't nearly enough.
I'm sure they did. And the prosecutor in the case, well, he made it clear how he felt about it. He looked Rardon right in the eye and said, "You should be electrocuted."
Oof, that's harsh. What did Rardon say to that?
He just said, "I suppose you're right. I deserve to die."
Pretty chilling, huh?
Wow, I mean, what do you even say to that? The guy admits he deserves to die for what he's done. It's almost surreal.
And then he does something totally unexpected. His attorney advises him to keep quiet, but Rardon, he turns to the families of his victims in the courtroom and...
He apologizes.
He does. He apologizes.
I wonder what was going through their minds. I mean, how do you even process something like that? To have the man who took your loved one, who shattered your world, stand there and apologize.
I can't imagine. Some of the family members were reported to have said things like, he's sorry, but with this bitterness, this skepticism, I mean, can you blame them? How do you forgive someone who's done something so monstrous?
It's a question that probably doesn't have an answer, but it does make you think about remorse. Can someone who does something so terrible truly feel sorry for it? And if they do, does it matter? Does it change anything? It's complicated, but the story doesn't end there. What happens next with Rardon in prison and his attempts to get paroled, it adds a whole other layer to this already complex case.
So this guy, right, he admits to these horrific murders, says he deserves to die, and then what? Spends decades trying to be like the perfect prisoner. It's hard to wrap your head around it.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the prison records show that Rardon did a total 180, learned computer skills, got a cooking certificate, even took some college courses. Makes you wonder, right? Was this a genuine attempt to, I don't know, to make up for what he did? Or was he just trying to game the system to look good for the parole board?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to know what was really going on inside his head. Maybe a little of both.
Maybe. And that's the thing about these kinds of cases. It's hard to say for sure whether someone like that can ever really change. Can someone who takes a life ever really, truly redeem themselves?
It's a tough question. And I bet those parole hearings were Pretty intense, especially for the families of the victims.
Oh, absolutely. They were incredibly emotional. You had Rardon on one side saying he was a changed man, expressing remorse, and then the families on the other side demanding justice for their loved ones, still struggling with the pain and anger.
So what was Rardon like during these hearings? Did he seem sincere?
Well, the parole board, they were obviously skeptical, right? Given his history of manipulation. I mean, they saw his good behavior in prison, but, they had to wonder if it was all just an act.
And what did Rardon say to that? How did he respond?
He kept insisting that he wasn't the same person anymore, that he turned his life around. He even admitted that his murders were, and I quote, pretty cold-blooded, said that he'd lost it during that time in Chicago.
Wow. So he finally acknowledged how brutal his crimes were. Did he ever try to explain why he did it?
He blamed it on anger management issues and alcohol abuse. Said that he developed empathy for others, something he claimed he didn't have before. Basically, he presented himself as someone who had undergone a profound transformation. Someone who deserved a second chance.
Did he have a plan for if he got out? Like what he would do, where he would live?
Yeah, he said he would live with family in the Champaign-Urbana area, rely on them for support while he, tried to reintegrate into society. Pretty simple plan, but it did seem like he was looking for a quiet, law-abiding life.
So after all that, did they grant him parole?
It was a tough decision, but ultimately they deny him parole. They said that his addictive behavior and his remorse, it just didn't outweigh the severity of his crimes. Basically, they felt that some acts are just too horrific to be forgiven, no matter how much someone might change.
That must have been a crushing blow for him. Did he ever give up hope?
He did keep appealing for parole, but those state convictions kept him locked up. But there was a twist. He ended up completing his federal sentences, for the stolen vehicle and the unregistered firearm. And because of that, in 2020...
Wait, they let him go? After all those years?
Yeah. After nearly 50 years behind bars, Gary Rardon was a free man.
Wow. I can only imagine the range of emotions people must have felt, especially the victims' families.
It was definitely a controversial decision. It sparked a lot of debate about, the balance between punishment and rehabilitation, about whether some crimes are simply unforgivable. There are no easy answers in cases like this.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the limits of forgiveness, about the lasting impact of these kinds of crimes. Rardon did die a few years later, in 2024. He was 80 years old. But the questions his case raises, they linger.
They do. It's a story that challenges our understanding of justice, of redemption, even of human nature itself. And that's what makes these deep dives so compelling, right? They don't always give us clear-cut answers, but they force us to confront the complexity of the world, to grapple with the gray areas.
Absolutely. And sometimes the questions are just as important as the answers, maybe even more so. Well, thanks for joining me on this journey, for exploring this dark and fascinating case with me. And we'll be back soon with another deep dive, another story that'll make you think, make you question, and hopefully make you see the world in a whole new light.